And so I want to move now into a discussion of Sri Aurobindo's book, The Human Cycle. It's much shorter than his magnum opus, The Life Divine, and I think, as we'll see, much easier to get a grip on, at least initially. Um, um, One of the things about it, it is a grand meta-narrative. It was written by Aurobindo in Pondicherry, India in 1918, so about the time that the First World War was coming to a close, and about the time that Spengler was writing The Decline of the West. It is a grand meta-narrative. And I think, though, that the rumored death of the grand meta-narrative has been something that is not going to really hold for very long. I think the antidote to it, the antidote to Foucault's chapter, The Introduction to the Archaeology of Knowledge, in which he announces the death of the grand meta-narrative by saying essentially that big historical narratives are over, and now it's time for micro-narratives, even though much of his work is organized and presupposes a grand meta-narrative, whereupon he divides European history into the sovereign phase, the disciplinary phase, and the biopolitical phase. So he does have his own meta-narrative. That's the central irony of one of the main demolishers or deconstructionists of grand meta-narratives, is that he was operating out of his own. So, but I think the antidote to that chapter can be found in the opening chapter of Peter Sloterdijk's recent book, In the World Interior of Capital, in which he says that the reasons for the disintegration of the grand meta-narrative was because of a suspicion that such narratives were inevitably Eurocentric, and they were tied to the colonialist interests of the lootings of the nation-states of Europe that always tended to skew history in their favor and in their direction, and use these narratives as a means of dominating and subjugating the conquered populations of the globe. And of course, this led to the Great War, the World War I and World War II, which I think future historians will look back on as the war of grand meta-narratives, the communist meta-narrative versus the fascist meta-narrative versus the Anglo-American French democratic shopping mall meta-narrative. That's the one that won, as we all know. But I think that Sloterdijk says that these narratives are useful. They are still useful if they can be decoupled from these kinds of colonialist biases and these kinds of racist connotations and the political and ethical agendas that they tend to be put in service to. If they can be decoupled from those interests, I think that they are still useful. And then he does indeed proceed to, in that introduction, go into his grand meta-narrative about the three different phases of globalization. Globalization phase one being the Greeks and Aristotle, Eratosthenes figuring out the circumference of the earth, Aristotle discussing the spheres, cosmology, and so forth, that lasts all the way down to about the time of Dante, who apotheosizes it. And then we move into the second phase of globalization, which is the age of the great Portuguese navigators exploring the earth with their ships, and the shift in the heavens from Ptolemy to Copernicus, who decenters the cosmos, and Kepler, who squashes the perfect circles of the planetary orbits into ellipses. And that's the middle age, the sort of metaphysical age of globalization that lasts all the way down to 1945, whereupon with 1945 we get the electronic phase of globalization, in which the globe itself is flattened out to a single point-like unity, since every place, no place really is, distance is completely annihilated, as Heidegger predicted that it would be, by these electronic signals, and there's a sense of rapidity of movement. Water has become the primary element, since 95% of all trade now occurs with ships carrying freight across the seas. That's his grand meta-narrative that he opens up in The World Interior of Capital with, and I find it to be a very interesting one. But now what I want to do here is to look at Sri Aurobindo's narrative that he wrote back in 1918, his sort of vision of history, which he borrows from a German philosopher, an obscure one named Lamprecht. I don't know whether he read Spengler or not, but he borrows Lamprecht's meta-narrative of seeing history in terms of 5 stages: the symbolic, the typal, the conventional, the individualistic, and the subjective. Those are the 5 ages that he proceeds to discuss. And the first age that he discusses, that Aurobindo discusses, basing it on Lamprecht's model, is the symbolic, in which all civilizations are, of course, dominated by religion. Um, Everything is metaphysical and religious. If we look in India, this would be the period of the Rig Veda, through the Brahmanas to the Upanishads, the period of the formation of the great religious insights, and the whole of society is religiously motivated, and there's no two ways about that. It's the same in every one of these high civilizations in Old Kingdom Egypt, or whether we're talking about the time of the Mycenaean Greeks, um, or the period of the cathedrals in Northern Europe. It's all religiously motivated at the inceptual phase. But then this phase gives rise to the second phase, which Aurobindo calls the typal, in which we have a shift to social and psychological types, which then begin to gain the field. The shift moves from religious orientation per se to the typification of the estates, the basic classes of society: nobility, priesthood, bourgeois, commoner, serf, and so forth. In India, this would have been the four castes, solidifying the Brahmin, the Kshatriya, the Vaishya, and the Shudra. And they're given their characteristic stamp or temperament during this period, and they are separated out. We get the wisdom that is the characteristic of the Brahmin, the courage that is the characteristic mark of the Kshatriya, the honor that is the characteristic mark of the Vaishya, and the obedience and subordination that marks the hardworking Shudra, who is at the bottom of society. And it's analogized to a cosmic man, with the Brahmin representing the head, the Vaishya the arms, the Shudra, or the Kshatriya the arms, the warrior caste, the Vaishya the legs, and the Shudra the feet. And that's the vision during this typal phase, in which the caste system predominates. In Europe, this was, of course, the period of the feudal age, with the serfs, the nobility, the priesthood, and then eventually the rise of the middle classes. And then the typal period gives rise to the conventional stage. And in the conventional stage, what happens is that it becomes more important to perform the rites rather than to believe them. And the clothing becomes more important than the actual man or the ideas that he embodies. There becomes a period, there comes into being a period of conventionalization, a stiffening and petrifaction of social roles into types that are fixed. And so we get, for instance, Confucius is a classic example of this in China, because Confucius was a man who upheld the Zhou period as the great golden age that he had seen Chinese civilization as having fallen away from. And his idea was to restore it by restoring all the conventions of filial piety and Ren and the gentleman. And performing the rites was more important. It didn't matter whether you believed in the gods for Confucius or not. Performing the rites was the essential and key thing, because the performance of the rites upheld the social order. And so you get this age of conventionalization where everybody's simply, nothing new is really happening. Everybody's simply conforming to types that have been set up in the previous typal period, only now it's stiffened and conventionalized into a period of petrifaction. But now this period of conventionality can become so stiffened and rigidified that it in turn generates the next phase, the age of individualism, sometimes known as the age of reason, in which certain individuals then begin to rebel against this order. In our case, this begins with the Protestants, with Martin Luther, in philosophy with Descartes, and the rebellion against the social order that leads to the French Revolution. This would correspond to the shift out of Foucault's sovereign age into his disciplinary age, which is an age dominated by institutions, but it's an age characterized by rebellion. And I think in the ancient civilizations, though he doesn't mention this, I think that Lao Tzu is a representative of this, because Lao Tzu represents the individual going off into the woods, following his own path and rejecting the Confucian emphasis on following the rites. Lao Tzu isn't interested in the rites and conventions, which he regards as stiffened and petrified. He simply wants to follow the patterns of nature. So the patterns, Li, the grand law, the patterns of nature, he's going to take from the bark of the trees and the feel of the scales of the fish and the wind blowing. Those are going to be his transcendental signifieds that he's going to order and arrange and align his life by, rather than what Confucius does, is to uphold already dead social forms that are patterns that are being derived from the state, not for Lao Tzu. And I think in Egypt this becomes, the similar figure there is Akhenaten, who is the one who rebels against the social order by, in his case, wanting to go back to a golden age. Akhenaten thought that he was going back to the sort of very early First Dynasty or pre-dynastic Old Kingdom Egypt, where the social forms were not dominated by the Theban priesthood, and the sun god was paramount with Re and the Re sun god cults that came along in the 4th Dynasty and in the 5th Dynasty, the production of the grand solar temples that were temples and monuments to the sun god Re. Essentially, Akhenaten was retrieving that sun god cult and translating into the cult of the Atun disk, but at the expense of getting rid of all the funerary deities, all the deities of the night sea journey, the whole journey of Re's descent into the underworld through the Nile that runs underneath the earth in Amenti, through Amenti, the Egyptian underworld, where demons of the night and astral spirits have to be fought. All that's missing. Akhenaten simply cuts the lower half of the sun's journey out and leaves intact simply its rising and setting, and leaves all the roofs off of the temples so that the sun basically is its own altar, and one can perform mass in these temples with the god directly above one. And Akhenaten represents this kind of individualistic revolt against the stiffening and petrifying of the Theban priesthood and the social stereotypes that are rigidifying the civilization into an unworkable order. He tries to break it up. And I think the figure of Gilgamesh represents something similar too. In Mesopotamia, Gilgamesh, in the Gilgamesh epic, which is written by the Babylonians, wants to break away from the social order as typified by the state of Uruk with its decayed worship of Inanna, the great priestess, who commands castration on the part of her priests, and the inevitable death and submission of the god king, the Lugal, who submits to her order. Gilgamesh refuses to submit to her order, and in refusing that, he isn't simply spurning the goddess, he's actually rejecting the conventions of the Mesopotamian state, of Uruk, the city of Uruk, and its traditional forms of worship. And he leaves that and goes out through the wilderness, leaves Uruk behind, and goes out in quest of a private vision quest experience. He goes back to find one of the old ones, one of what Lovecraft would call the old ones, and in this case it's Utnapishtim, the man who survived the dissolution of the world by flood 25,920 years earlier. And if you count the number of years on the king list from Utnapishtim to Gilgamesh, you'll see that they come to just about 26,000 years. One complete cycle of the precession of the equinoxes. And so he finds a world vision, or attempts to get a vision from Utnapishtim, traverses the zodiac in doing so, and comes back with a knowledge of the whole that awards him the right to become the judge of the dead in the underworld after his death. But it's the same principle of individualism that I think Aurobindo is talking about here, in which there is a rejection and a revolt against the social patterns and norms and stereotypes of a rigidifying society. But he says, though, that the West represents this tendency better than any of the other civilizations in the past, in such a way that ever since the period of the Renaissance, since about 1500, it's become the norm for the West. And he says that it's dangerously anarchic and can lead to a society in which there are no truths. That's exactly what has, of course, happened. In which there are no truths, there are no standards of behavior, and in which, as Cornelius Castoriadis would have called them, the imaginary significations no longer work for anyone at all, and everyone is just sort of on his own, and you end up with this social chaos. That's what Aurobindo was afraid would happen in 1918 when he was talking about this Western ideal of the individualist society, and that is precisely what has happened. But he says that what happens in such an individualist society in which the authorities of the past are not trusted and they're questioned, they're brought into question. Descartes brings the whole academic world of the Parisian universities into question and wants to think for himself and not rely upon the dogmas of Aristotle. And in doing so, founds a whole new development in the course of philosophical history, inaugurates it. Martin Luther doesn't want anything to do with the Pope. Doesn't want life to be stereotyped along the Catholic transcendental signifieds, so he dismantles them, deconstructs them, and the iconotypes go down. They actually wash away off the walls of the Dutch churches. They simply disappear from Dutch and German churches. They're not there anymore. And so there's a danger, there's a nihilistic danger to this individualism where the transcendental signifieds, or the imaginary significations that uphold the social order, the gods basically, the archetypes, once they're deconstructed and they go down the drain, you have to have something in their place, or you do end up with social anarchy.